I've got to admit, I really wasn't looking forward to Max Payne 3. For one thing, it was the first time the franchise wasn't being developed by series creators Remedy. Instead, Rockstar was at the helm, and at least superficially it seemed like a poor fit. The linear nature of the first game's design didn't seem to gel well with the studio that brought you Red Dead Redemption and Grand Theft Auto 4. And aside from a few gimmick cutscenes, Max Payne has always played its universe pretty straight, while Rockstar is known for violently whipping back and forth between the maudlin and the parodic. Then the trailers came out, and it didn't really inspire any further confidence. The original two games were a mishmash of Hong Kong action movies, gritty film noir detective stories, and The Matrix. Max wears long leather coats, dives headlong into danger in slow motion while firing guns akimbo, and sets about dishing out video game justice in a frigid and snow-blown New York City. So imagine my shock when the first Max Payne 3 footage looked like this. There's nothing really film noir, John Woo, or Matrixy about any of this. At first blush, it looks more like a sequel to Kane and Lynch than it does to Max Payne. Then the game actually came out, and I gotta say, I had it more or less completely backwards. It's actually a proper stakes-raising sequel, not just in the narrative sense, but also thematically, and probably most important to the Max Payne brand, aesthetically. If John Woo and the Wachowskis were the inspirations for Max Payne 1 and 2, then Tony Scott and Michael Mann are the inspirations for Max Payne 3. The original two games were really enjoyable third-person shooters, but what made them really memorable were the stylistic choices that framed the entire experience of playing them as an homage to Hard Boiled, Face Off, or The Matrix. This emphasis on aesthetic value is carried forward to Max Payne 3, but it's been updated to reflect a different, more modern cinematic sensibility. There are clear nods to Michael Mann's 2006 Miami Vice film, as well as the cold, detached digital camera techniques that Mann brought to the action movie genre. And the game takes Tony Scott's indulgence in image distortion and on-screen text from his films like Man on Fire and Domino and cranks it up to 10. So gone are flowing leather trench coats and seedy back alleys. Now we get Armani suits without ties while looking stoic in a nightclub full of happy people. The cello and piano soundtrack from the first game has been replaced with a noise rock soundtrack courtesy of Health. The comic book presentation, while alluded to in the loading screens and occasional 24-like panels, has mostly been replaced with distortions of a failing digital camera. All of this reflects a modern sensibility that reinforces how far removed from Max Payne's halcyon days we really are, how detached and damaged Max Payne has become. And what really makes this work is that the stories of the films this new aesthetic is referencing dovetail nicely with where they've taken Max Payne as a character. So, just a quick recap for those who haven't played the first two games. In 1998, Max Payne's wife and child were killed by junkies addicted to a new drug called Valkyr. 2 years later, Max stumbles upon the conspiracy surrounding this new drug, kills hundreds of mafiosos, and gets his revenge. Surprisingly, he doesn't go to jail for this insane vigilante killing spree, as enacting his revenge conveniently put him on the good side of some very powerful people called the Inner Circle. In 2003, Max falls for a hit woman named Mona while trying to escape another complicated plot about infighting among the Inner Circle's members, only she doesn't make it. Which brings us to present day. 14 years after his budding family was taken from him and 9 years since he last gave a damn about anyone including himself, Max Payne has ended up a self-destructive alcoholic for whom life has no meaning, not even revenge. Instead, he seeks oblivion at the bottom of bottles of booze and painkillers. And really, Max Payne 3 deals with alcoholism as a major theme in a way that shows a lot of restraint on the part of Rockstar. Need I remind you that one of their last games made drunk driving a hilarious side quest, but here, drinking is literally Max Payne's big character flaw. If the game's trying to do anything, it's trying to tell the story of a self-destructive man's redemption. It's clear that the driving force in the narrative is Tony Scott's 2004 film Man on Fire. The summary of the narratives is almost identical, really. An alcoholic American gringo ex-government agent is hired on the cheap as a bodyguard in a foreign country, whose drinking and personal issues cause him to utterly fail those placed in his charge. He then tries to correct his professional failings through vengeance as an allegory for redeeming those personal failures. Along the way, he's manipulated by a federal agent who is after the same people as our protagonist, there's a money exchange that goes bad, and family members betray one another for power and money. It's really such a basic retelling of the Man on Fire story that I'm sort of surprised A.J. Quinnell or Brian Hedgeland weren't given some sort of writing credit. Many scenes feel more or less identical, like the late-night drinking binges. With stories so similar, it's hard not to make direct comparisons to the narratives, and Man on Fire kinda wins out here. Man on Fire is about a man named Creasy, who is racked with guilt for his previous actions as a government agent, who drinks to escape the culpability of his actions. But a young girl coaxes him out of his shell and convinces him that life is worth living again. Then she's kidnapped, causing him to snap and paradoxically seek atonement for his sins by doing the very things that drove him to self-destruction. In contrast, Max Payne is about a man who is racked with loss and, over a decade later, seems incapable of moving on. It's easy to empathize with him, especially given the deft writing that manages to carry just enough wry cynicism to be amusing without ever tipping over into campy parody. But unlike Creasy, nothing seems to motivate his salvation. He mumbles some lines about wanting to see the guy who pulls the trigger to kill him when he quits cold turkey.
I decided that I was gonna die sober, not drunk. At least then I would see who shot me.
Nothing is really sacrificed, and as a result, his redemption doesn't feel earned the way Creasy's did. I'm sick of being a drunk loser doesn't sound like a powerful enough motivation to fuel a murder rampage. While both Man on Fire and Max Payne 3 end as revenge tales, one of them is actually the story of a man avenging something he believed in. The other is just an action hero being used as somewhat awkward political commentary. And yes, Max is being pretty clearly used by the Housers as a conduit to bring up various political topics. Which I applaud in theory, it's just that the ideas are dismissed as casually as they're brought up, with nothing of substance to add to them. Class warfare is a hot topic out the gate, with the game name-dropping trickle-down economics and bringing up the nature of American capitalism.
I guess they call it trickle-down economics.
Say what you want about Americans, but we understand capitalism. You buy yourself a product and you get what you pay for. And these chumps had paid for some angry gringo without the sensibilities to know right from wrong.
The drug-fueled half of Max's stay in Brazil is spent with a super-rich, who uses addiction as a means of controlling him, and after breaking his habits, he ends up in the slums, searching for the truth. It's a heavy-handed metaphor that equates wealth with manipulation and poverty with some sort of honesty or inner truth, and I'm not really sure where they were going with it. Rockstar also emphasized Max's status as an American foreigner, who means well but only knows how to interact with people using guns, and ultimately makes things much worse.
The American, running around, acting like the action hero, killing lots of people.
In the end, the ham-fisted attempts at turning Max Payne into a vehicle for substantive political discourse end up conflicting with the story's main redemption of a lost cause motif, and end up further hurting the story in comparison to Man on Fire. Where one is a concise story about a broken man redeeming himself the only way he knows how, the other is the story of a man in the middle of a violent midlife crisis the authors attempt to turn into a meaningful allegory about military intervention, and it looks sloppy and overreaching in comparison. Now, if it seems like I'm putting a lot of undue emphasis on narrative, there's a reason for that. It seems like the developers did too. Before we get into it, it has to be said that the Max Payne franchise complements the Hauser's style well. Far better than Grand Theft Auto 4 or Red Dead, in fact, whose open worlds hurt narrative pacing and direction. In contrast, Max Payne's linear level-to-level progression allows the story to feel like a driving force that's core to the experience, instead of something you visit only when you're not playing darts or shooting pigeons. But the emphasis on narrative also creates a really non-ludic experience. The game supposedly has somewhere in the range of 4 hours of cutscenes, and honestly, I'd believe it. The general structure of the gameplay is thus. You enter a room full of guys and shoot them full of holes. Then a cutscene plays that's anywhere from 30 seconds to 5 or 10 minutes. Then you enter another room and rinse repeat. They interrupt the gameplay basically after every room is cleared, and it effectively segments gameplay into a series of challenge rooms rather than cohesive levels. And after a few hours, it quickly becomes apparent that core gameplay simply wasn't a focus of their development efforts. I mean, don't get me wrong, everything you love from previous Max Payne games is here and largely unscathed. There's shoot dodging, there's slow motion, there's guns akimbo, there's a painkiller driven health system, there's firing at enemies while prone on your back. There are even a few levels in a snow-swept New Jersey, complete with leather jacket. Mechanically, at least, this is still very much a Max Payne game. But there's lots of little gameplay annoyances that seem to pop up due to the emphasis on cutscenes and cinematic presentation. For example, the game loves doing the old cutscene weapon switch, where you'll have a shotgun or rifle out during the gameplay, only to reach the next cutscene trigger and watch a clip of Max running around with his pistol drawn. Then when the game seamlessly slides back into the gameplay from the cutscene, the pistol is still drawn. This doesn't sound immediately annoying, but since the cutscenes are every 4 to 6 minutes, what should be a small bother slowly becomes a big frustration.
Son of a bitch!
You okay?
About the same as before. Looking forward to getting out of this shithole.
You know there's someone shooting at us.
There are actually lots of these sorts of minor issues. If you walk past some painkillers but trigger a cutscene that moves you into the next room, you often can't go back and get them because the cutscene auto-magically locks the door behind you. Also, for some reason, and I suspect the Euphoria engine, Max can't go from prone to cover after a shoot dodge. Max has to stand completely upright in the middle of a gunfight while you spam the cover button, and only after his fancy blended animation is played out can you get out of danger. They even added a neat Borderlands-style feature where if you have any painkillers left when you reach 0 health, you're given a chance for a second win by shooting the enemy that killed you. Except it never quite feels like it works the way it should. Your view becomes zoomed in on the enemy and your aim gravitates straight towards them. Except you can't reload, and if you had expended the last bullet of your clip before being shot, or miss with your last bullet because of unfortunate environmental geometry, then you're just SOL. And even if you manage to hit the guy, Max immediately ragdolls to the floor, only to stand straight up again before taking cover, often putting your health right back to where you started if a firefight is still taking place. I appreciate the effort to make the game less immediately lethal, but this implementation feels clunky and aggravating when you have to wait for the timer to run out because your clip happened to empty, just to die and reload. Now, these things aren't game-breaking, and the core experience of shooting men in slow motion is still enjoyable, I guess, if that's your thing. But these issues do highlight a lackadaisical, disinterested approach to the game's core design in favor of squeezing that much more fidelity out of their cutscenes. And nowhere is this more distressingly apparent than when you realize just how completely and utterly disjointed the gameplay is from its narrative. In the opening acts of the game, Max Payne is a depressed, washed up, out of shape, borderline sociopathic alcoholic whose mind is pickled from ethanol and addled by a decade of opiate abuse. And this is how they systemize that in gameplay. Halfway through the game, Max, having failed utterly in his sole duty of defending the Broncos, reaches his nadir. He quits alcohol cold turkey and completely transforms his appearance to reflect his rebirth. He begins to piece his life back together by finishing his job, as it's the only thing he has left. Here's what that looks like in gameplay. Now, I get that Max Payne is a shooter franchise, and they weren't exactly going to have Max Payne going to AA meetings or teaching Brazilian kids how to read as the game mechanics of the second half of the game. But you would think that with such a major character change, the gameplay would somehow reflect that. And you could have done it either way. You could have made the point that ditching the drugs and alcohol was good by boosting the amount of bullet time you have, or making it so that it refills on its own. Explain it by saying Max has a sharper mind when he isn't drunk, that his senses and reaction times were no longer dulled by booze. Man on Fire even brings this up.
I drink.
How does that affect you?
Coordination, reaction time.
It would even benefit you going into the final acts of the game, allowing designers to ratchet up the craziness of the final levels even higher, and leaving the player wondering how they'd ever do it without Max having quit drugs and given them all the extra bullet time. On the flip side, Rockstar could have used gameplay mechanics to emphasize the fact that kicking old habits comes at a sacrifice. Max is supposedly undergoing the mother of all hangovers, and his emotional and physical comfort blankets are gone. Since he's hurting and vulnerable, they could have gotten rid of the painkiller health mechanic and put it on slow regen, or reduce the amount of bullet time that could be stored at once. Make the player feel like they too have sacrificed or gained something, that they've been liberated or harmed by the events of the narrative. Use the game mechanics at your disposal to reinforce the story you think is so damned important to tell. If they don't interact at all, you're just making us play a carnival game over and over in between your precious cutscenes. Finally, the serious tone of the narrative clashes so severely with the absurdity of the violence on display that once again we run into our old friend ludonarrative dissonance. It's actually so distracting here that The Guardian of all places actually ran a story on how Max Payne 3 struggles to reconcile its introspective protagonist with a body count that Rambo would be envious of. There's a reason that big-budget action games generally don't go for this more seriously written style of character, instead focusing on either featureless everymen like Gordon Freeman or violent dude bros ready for the slaughter like Marcus Phoenix. It's hard to take Max Payne, the man who 14 years later laments the death of his family, the man who has a serious alcohol and drug problem, the man who we're supposed to empathize with as he deals with serious inner demons, and see him as anything other than a giant walking turret, since the gameplay involves nothing but shooting people in insanely violent ways. Max Payne is a AAA game franchise whose mechanics are about shooting. The gameplay was always going to be about shooting. As a result, try as you might, you can't make this story not about shooting dudes without making either the gameplay or the story irrelevant. And in this instance, Rockstar decided on the former. All the classic Max Payne gameplay is there. It's just playing second fiddle to the narrative, much to its detriment. And I want to defend the narrative itself. It's not every day we get a AAA third-person shooter about overcoming alcoholism and a nihilistic sense of self-doubt and loathing. But it's so far removed from the gameplay that I can't help but compare it to films that have done the same thing way, way better. It's a AAA shooter that's really conservative in its gameplay mechanics, but surprisingly risky in its narrative. And I can appreciate the sentiment, but considering that this is a video game, I can't help but think it should be better the other way around.